Hello and welcome everybody to our first eSport lunch lecture this year. We will be covering the two-way player contracts the VCT introduced last year and briefly house rules before. We will have 15 to 20 minutes hopefully of presentation by Nepomuk today and conclude with a Q&A afterwards. The presentation will be recorded as always, and in a small advertisement in our own case will be published on our YouTube channel, where you can find the other 16 more parts of the lunch lectures still relevant, and we are always happy to receive likes or follows on the channel. As well as if you want to stay up to date with our other activities, please subscribe to our newsletter as well. That said, Nepomuk, stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Great to be back for the now part 17, which is kind of crazy, but of course amazing. We're going to talk about the VCT and the two-way player contracts today. Some of you might not be esports experts, so trying to get you up to speed on the VCT part first. What is the VCT? Well, the VCT is, or this is the VCT actually, or this is where the VCT leads if everything works out well. This VCT stands for Valorant Champions Tour, and the VCT is the prime league and of course the prime esports entertainment product in the game, or for the game Valorant, by publisher Riot Games, who is, by the way, also the tournament organizer of the VCT. So not just the publisher, but also the tournament organizer on the VCT level. By the way, where did I steal that picture from? Easy answer, as Moritz already said. We had a great presentation from Graham Ashton from Riot Games last year in one of our esports lunch lectures. So if you want to check this out, all about the VCT structure, have a look at our YouTube channel. But this is what we're actually going to talk about today, two-way player contracts. So first of all, the big question is, of course, what is a two-way player or a two-way player contract? Typically, when we have a player in the esports ecosystem, we have a single team exclusivity rule. Mostly by the teams, of course, the organizations for which the player plays, because at the end of the day, it just makes sense to don't have your player play for another team, especially a competitor, of course. And in esports, everything commercial, their content creation, their streaming is hugely important. So it just makes sense to have the player as an exclusive player. In the Riot Cosmos, this is even a rule, which is called the single team exclusivity rule. So what is the two-way player contract? First of all, we have a player contract with a team. This team, in advance, we'll call secondary team, which in the VCT, for example, competes in the Challenger League. If you don't remember the VCT structure, don't worry, I got you covered. The next slide will give you all the information you'll need for today. But yeah, that's the first contract. You have a player, which has a player contract with a secondary team. The Challenger League is like a minor league. This is not the VCT level, but the one or the multiple levels below. Also, the player is not only subject to this, what they call valid player contract, but also to this valid written esports service agreement. Everything, by the way, is Riot Games terms. So this may sound a little bit weird, but just for your knowledge, esports service agreement for another team. So this, of course, is on first look kind of strange because there's a single team exclusivity. So we have a player contract with a secondary team and the esports service agreement with the VCT team, the team playing in the Valorant Champions Tournament. And of course, both of the teams are affiliated. They have the ARA, the so-called Affiliate Relationship Agreement, which is often called Inter-Team Agreement. So what's happening here? The player normally plays for the secondary team, but the VCT team has the option to draft him for specific games on the higher level, on the VCT level. So the player can play for both teams. And little spoiler here, you probably already guessed it. These are multiple contracts, not just 3 contracts. If you draft it the best way possible, in our opinion, this can be 5 agreements. So it can get a little bit complex. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them later, but hopefully I'll be able to answer most of them beforehand. So the single team exclusivity, of course, this is an exception. The only exception, actually, at least I know of, where we don't have the 2-way player contract, where we don't have the single team exclusivity. Of course, there's also a loan mechanism, but we'll get to that in a second. So why does this make sense? Why is that specific? First of all, this is not a VCT, a Valorant only thing. The LEC, the League of Legends ecosystem from Riot Games, the LEC is the EMEA competition, but the League of Legends Championship Circuit has something like this as well. But there's one huge difference, and that's important. The big difference is that in the League of Legends sphere, we have these big leagues, the LEC instead of the VCT, for example, and it's a closed shop. It's a closed system. There are only 10 slots, 10 teams. There's no way to get relegated to a minor league or to be relegated from the minor league to the major league. When we talk about the VCT, that's different because most of the teams are kind of fixed there as well. But through this part, you see here the path to pro, the challenger part, you can actually relegate from a minor league to the VCT leagues, at least for a certain amount of seasons. So through this Ascension tournaments, you can be relegated to a top league. The big difference for the 2-way contracts is it is possible that if you have, I jump back real quick, if you have a player that plays for a secondary team and for a VCT team, we get to the details in a second, and the secondary team qualifies for the VCT stage, then you have a big problem. So one of the big rules, of course, we'll get to that in a second, is that you're not able to have a affiliate relationship agreement that does not terminate if that happens. So every ARA needs to be terminated when that occurs, when the secondary team qualifies to the VCT team stage. So as a reminder, again, YouTube channel, also stolen that picture from Graham. Sorry, Graham. What is a 2-player contract? We, of course, need to talk about the different conditions because we have 3 relationships: the player with the VCT team, the player with the secondary team, and the VCT team and the secondary team. The first thing that's important is, and specific to the 2-way player contract situation is, players are listed on the full team rosters of the VCT team and of the, on the right, there should be the second team, by the way. I copied that maybe. So they're listed on the full team rosters of both the VCT team and the secondary team. The third thing is, there is secondary league, perfect. The player is eligible to play in the VCT and in the secondary league in the Challenger League. This is not a player loan because Riot Games also has a player loan mechanism. The interesting thing about that is that with the 2-way player situation, this is more reminiscent of the player loans in traditional sports. So you are able to be to play for the VCT team and for the secondary team. The player loan in the Riot Cosmos only allows you to play for the secondary team. You're a VCT player, but you can play for the secondary team. So the 2-way player contract system by Riot is more reminiscent of what we know about player loans in traditional sports, and the loan system from Riot Games is not really represented in traditional sport at all. So why do they have this? Well, the idea behind it is, of course, that the player loan system provides the VCT teams with an option to invest in talent development while enabling to have the player play on stage, because otherwise the player would just be on bench in the VCT team. So you can do everything when it comes to talent development, but at the same time you also get like competition experience, you could call it. The third thing is there's a 2-player maximum. So it's not like you can do this with your whole roster, and it's just a 2-player maximum. Nothing more to talk about there. The most interesting part is, or the two most interesting parts are coming now, in my opinion. There are like provisions when it comes to salary. If you play for, let's say, you're a player of the secondary team, but the VCT team executes the option. So you are kind of drafted to the VCT team for 1 week. Then your salary needs to be the VCT salary, the minimum salary for that week. So it's everything with a pro rata weekly basis at the end of the day. And this can, of course, get a little bit more complicated the more times you have the option executed. So this is really interesting, of course. Riot tries to apply with their own minimum salary standards here, or comply, of course, which is really interesting, but adds another layer of complexity on the operational level. Then there's the participation threshold, really interesting, only relevant for the VCT team, because if you have a player that played in 50% or more matches on the VCT level, they are no longer eligible to compete on the secondary level. So he actually becomes part of the VCT team. So in that case, you need a different contract. We'll get to the contract situation in a second. But what you see now, and of course, Moritz already said I only have 50 minutes, so I'm trying my best to be fast here. But there are multiple things that are specific to the two-way player contracts. I mean, the smartest thing would probably just be to subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch the video later on and pause the video. The other things, of course, are quite regular. So region restrictions, you need to have your player, if he's in the competition, if he's playing, he needs to be in the active player roster. Stuff like that applies as well. Really interesting is the VCT team and secondary team relationship, because the ARA needs approval by Riot, which means that whenever you have all of these contracts we're going to talk about in a second drafted, actually the best case scenario is that everything is already said and done, all of the contracts, because you need to send them into Riot and get approval by Riot. If I remember correctly, no later than 30 days prior to the effective date of the ARA agreement. So timing-wise, this can be a huge problem. So the smartest thing to do is to have everything set in stone before you sign all the contracts at once. As of right now, this is like the main thing. There are no more perks or specific situations. Nothing comes with having the ARA except for the two-way player contract mechanism. But Riot Games communicated that down the line there might be more incentives for teams to conclude an ARA with each other. So at the end of the day, this is what I already talked about, the big difference between the LEC two-way player system and the VCT player system, because there is a relegation possibility for the secondary team. You need to have a provision that terminates the ARA in case the secondary team gets promoted to the VCT level. Which means, of course, in that case, which is a rare case, of course, but you need to have provisions in place, the ARA needs provisions on that situation specifically. Next question, why is there a two-way player contract? If you want to be negative about it, you could just say, well, esports winter. I'm not a big fan of the esports winter because there are a lot of industries struggling right now, not just esports. Also, most of the economic problems affect one type of esports stakeholder specific, the teams, and mostly small and mid-sized teams. I'm not trying to downplay the economic pressure for a lot of the teams, but to call it esports winter for all of the industry, not too big of a fan. If you're not trying to be too negative about it, you could just say Riot Games wants to have a sustainable ecosystem when it comes to Valorant. Because the two-way player contract is not the only mechanism they implemented over the last months to have a more sustainable ecosystem, or to take some of that, to lift some of that economic pressure for teams. For example, revenue share models, especially when it comes to in-game stickers. There was a rule where you had like a mandatory substitute player on the team, which now is replaced by a new emergency substitute rule. For example, using the head coach as a stand-in player, something like that is possible again, which have been possible in the early years of esports, then not, then now again. Then the player loan mechanism I already talked about, and of course the two-way player contract. So it's all about making the esports ecosystems of Riot Games more sustainable. Now let's talk about the contracts. I know I'm a little bit behind schedule, but I try my best here, because this is not important, the really important part, but you needed the informations before, of course. What's the first one you need? It's a player contract between the player and the secondary team. As I already said, everything should be already set in stone. But if you like formally are trying to have like what's the first contract, what's the second, what the third, this is the first one you'll need. This is a normal player contract. It's fixed term. Again, in Germany, in the VCT or the LEC, Riot Games forces their teams to have employment contracts. So they're fixed terms, which means, for example, limited ways of terminating the player contracts. You want to have exclusivity, but really important, just exclusivity as long as the team, the secondary team, does not allow the player to play for another team. Here, of course, the VCT team. Then you'll need the ARA. Because otherwise the single team exclusivity rule we already talked about would be a problem. So you need a player contract, then the ARA that stipulates all of the important things between the VCT team and the secondary team, which is mostly important for securing exclusivity. Because sure, the secondary team has exclusivity for the player because of the player contract with the player, but the VCT team could struggle to get exclusivity otherwise, because the secondary team could just loan the same player to a competitor of the VCT team. So it's really important that these two contracts, actually all of the contracts, are in sync with each other, especially for exclusivity. Then we'll have the Esport service agreement. That's the agreement between the VCT team and the player, obviously, where we have the draft option. So there are many different ways to structure this, of course. The basis will always be this Esport service agreements, of course, but actually we decided that most of the time the smartest structure would be to have that Esport service agreement as a pre-contract, because again, it's important. This contract needs to be there from the beginning. This is super important. You cannot have the Esport service agreement 2 months after the ARA, for example. So the smartest way is to have like this pre-contract, which is quite short, actually, just the right amount of provisions, just not make it too complicated. But don't worry, it will get complicated, because if you have a look at the annex of this pre-contract, you typically have the big player contract. And typically it's not just one, because we already talked about the participation threshold. If the player plays more than 50% of the VCT games for the VCT team, you will have a full-blown player contract with the VCT team. And the player is not eligible to play in the secondary team's competition anymore, the Challenger League. So typically, you have this conglomerate of 3 contracts merged into one with annexes. So we are talking typically 70 pages onwards, which is for contracts in Germany quite a lot. For American contract, that's more normal, I'd say. For German contracts, that's more. So the most important thing here is that all of these contracts are in sync with each other. They need to be coordinated, not only coordinated when it comes to the content, but also to the timing, because you have, of course, the obligation by Riot Games to hand everything in with this 30-day period. This makes all of this complicated. And also, even clauses that are not typically really complex, like a clause that just stipulates the fixed term of the respective contract, because these fixed terms now need to be in sync with each other. And there are multiple different ways how to create that sync. So what are the challenges? And I promise then I'll be through with the session and happy to answer questions if I can, of course. What are the challenges? Well, the first one, does this even work under German law? German employment law is really, there's a high level of protection for the employee. Everything, we see it in the next one as well, everything when it comes to esports and employment law in Germany is complex. We don't really have Supreme Court rulings on it. But to be fair, if you have a focus on clarity of terms and conditions and you avoid uncertainty for employees, this will work. It's also that there are not really like specific German labor or employment law restrictions just because of the two-way contract situation. For example, the biggest fear everyone always has is this loan work? Is this unreal temporary work? Sorry for the rough translation here from German law, because there's a Temporary Employment Act you need to comply with, and that's really restrictive. But that's not the case here, because it's not even temporary work, because the employment contract with the secondary team, that's just suspended, not cancelled, not terminated. One of the biggest problems we think this system will face is everything regarding residence and work permit. Because in Germany, these are bound typically to a certain employer, not the employee. So what you need to do is apply for the right visa and communicate with the authorities. So there is a way. We can of course not dive too deep into it now because of time reasons. There are ways to manage this, but you need, as a club, you need to know which ways exist. Because without employer and employee residence and work permit, this can be really tough. Everything regarding, of course, paying taxes. I should have put that on its slide as well, but I thought I'd be over time by now. So there are multiple more problems, let's call them challenges, right? Problems are just challenges in disguise. There are multiple more, but especially tax related, of course. So yeah, thank you so much for this short, quote-unquote, presentation. I'm sorry I destroyed my time limit, but of course we will be here and happy to answer more questions. Thank you very much.